Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Donnell. I'm the manager of support services here at Alltrans. I'm happy to have the opportunity to introduce this morning's webcast on visual testing beyond weld inspection. This webinar will discuss a range of topics involving visual inspection. The presentation today is going to be done by Jim Donnell and Steve McCullough. Jim is the Vice President of Technical Services at Alltrans. Jim has worked in the rail industry for over 33 years and has been with Alltrans for over 21 years. He has his ASNT NDT Level 3 in 8 different NDT methods and is a senior AWS CWI. Steve is the Director of Welding and NDT at Alltrans. He has worked in the rail industry for over 32 years and has been with Alltrans for over 10 years. He has his ASNT NDT Level 3 in 5 different NDT methods and is a senior AWS CWI. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Alltrans is one of North America's largest railcar management consulting companies. We provide fleet management and technical services to a variety of railcar owners, shippers, as well as repair facilities. We are going to structure this presentation with approximately 45 minutes of content followed by 15 minutes of question and answer. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the question pane, which should be on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar window. We will work through the questions. I'd like to mention that Alltrans will have a number of upcoming webinars over the next few weeks. We currently have the following scheduled. Keeping your NDT program compliant during the current COVID-19 trend on Wednesday, April 22nd, and critical to quality characteristics for quality assurance programs. This is on Wednesday, April 29th. Registration emails will be sent out soon. That being said, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'm happy to introduce Jim Donnell and Steve McCullough.
Morning, everybody. Jim Donnell here. We have a little Alltrans. I hope everybody's doing okay in this kind of crazy times. This disclaimer here, this presentation is basically an overview of visual testing. How visual testing applies to your individual program is really a company decision. It also depends upon your components and processes, federal regulations, AAR regulations, and customer requirements. So we're just going to talk about it, visual testing in general. How it applies to your program will be your decision. Part one, we'll get into some visual techniques. First, I'd like to do is come up with a definition so we all understand when we say visual testing, what we mean. I put on the screen here 2 definitions that I found. One is in Chapter 1, AR Chapter 1. Visual inspection is a non-destructive test method utilizing vision to detect surface imperfections in materials, including welds. Also found in ASME, a definition for visual examination, a non-destructive examination method used to evaluate an item by observation, such as a correct assembly, service conditions, or cleanliness of materials, parts, and components used in fabrication and construction of an ASME code vessels and hardware. So you can see those are a little bit slightly different. One uses a visual inspection, ASME uses it as visual examination. They all really mean the same thing. Visual testing, examination, inspection, all fall under visual. Some misconception with visual testing. Often visual inspection, other than weld inspection, is not considered a non-destructive test. Another misconception is visual testing is only for structural integrity inspections of railroad tank cars. And another one is visual technicians do not need to be certified unless it's weld inspection. So let's talk about some facts about visual testing. Visual testing is a very broad NDT method. It's an NDT method, and it has probably the most techniques, sub-techniques of the method more than any other non-destructive method. And those techniques do vary very differently from each other. Another thing to think about is most other NDT methods, liquid penetrant mag particle, radiography, usually the component will first have to pass a visual. Visual testing is a cost-effective, appropriate inspection method, but is very dependent upon the following. qualified personnel, qualified procedures, and proper acceptance criteria. And then some limitations we really think about with visual testing compared to maybe some other volumetric methods is inspection method is only finding defects that are open to the surface. That's one of the biggest limitations of visual testing. Direct visual requires line of sight to the test surface. If you don't have line of sight to the test surface, you may be using remote visual, but that falls under visual testing. And the instruments may be required for access to the area, and there may be some special training you want to do on how to use the instruments. Like any other method, it's knowledge of the test object is very important, and with visual, proper illumination is essential of the test area. So let's talk about some of the techniques, and this list is by no means all the techniques with visual testing, but these are some of the techniques that we may use in our industry. Direct visual testing, remote visual, attribute inspection, even when you're doing dimensional inspections or dimensional measurements. We'll talk a little bit about these as we go. Incoming inspection, and also obviously weld inspection. And each one of those techniques can be very different different from each other. So let's talk about some of the common applications that you would use visual testing in our industry. There may be applications looking at castings, forgings, fabricated components, fastener inspection, corrosion inspection, maybe valve assembly and rebuild, incoming inspection. You can think about areas like that, weld inspection, obviously, and qualification of tank cars. Really talking about the structural integrity inspections that are due on tank cars. So you can see lots of different techniques, lots of different applications. Okay, so part two is how do we apply these how do these applications apply to tank cars? Well, you may be doing casting inspection, looking for casting defects. Again, these are not weld inspection; these are casting defects, and casting defects have their own particular types of defects that you may not see in a weld. Gauging. This is showing you some gauging of ring gauges and plug gauges used for they're a valve plug and then a valve using a plug and a ring gauge. Again, those you're doing gauging, but it's also part of a visual test, looking at threaded components. But think about corrosion inspection. Corrosion is basically a visual inspection. And you're looking for corrosion inspection, and you may have to do some measurements of corrosion. That's all part of visual. How to use the pit gauges to measure corrosion, maybe general corrosion, some local corrosion, and there's various types of different corrosion, but that's all part and can possibly fall under visual inspection. Then obviously visual weld inspection. I think we're pretty familiar with that as a visual test, and most standards do mention about certification of visual weld inspectors. So when we say visual testing, in part three, we're going to talk basically about visual testing standards. So some regulatory inspection standards that state visual testing in the standard would be the 49 CFR, the AR M1002, basically a tank car manual, the TDG up in Canada, basically TP 1480-877 mentions, and we will show some excerpts out of these standards in the next couple slides. ASME Section 5, and then obviously American Welding Society D15.1. All those standards mention at some point in the standard about visual inspection. So let's take a look at some of those standards. Regulatory inspection standards, again, 49 CFR sections call out visual weld inspections. Appendix D and B in the C3 manual. And 1002 C3 manual calls out inspection. And again, ASME Section 5, Article 9, which is visual examination. And this is a little bit of caveat here, but there are several regulatory standards that govern if visual test inspection is required. But again, in my opinion, the regulation should be clear if this person has to be certified. So many standards state to do a visual examination, but whether that person has to be certified many times is not crystal clear. So let's get into the 49 CFR. If you look at 18509, it mentions visual inspection. At a minimum, each tank car facility must visually inspect the tank externally and internally as follows. I don't want to read everything there, but it talks about an internal inspection visually of tank shell heads, abrasions, for abrasions, corrosions, cracks, dents, distortions, defects in the welds, and other conditions that might make it unsafe for transportation, and so on. So you can clearly see visual inspection is dictated in the 49 CFR. So then we'll get into the AAR standard, M1002 C3 Appendix D. If you go into Appendix D, under 3.1.2, all inspections mentioned herein shall be conducted in accordance with the requirements of 49 CFR Subpart 80, which I just kind of showed you one aspect, and AAR specifications M1002 Appendix T. It says all the inspections mentioned herein, and visual inspection is mentioned. And it further goes on to say acceptability for use during tank qualification are shown in Appendix T, and that would be your qualification certification standard, Table T1, and the applicability of the particular method for the given inspection area shall be determined by the NDT Level 3. Further, in Appendix D in 362, it mentions in 3613, talks about a single cap gasket there, but mainly in 362, threaded surfaces and gasket seating surfaces must be visually inspected for corrosion and or mechanical damage. Again, I'm mentioning visual inspection. And looking at Canadian regulations, it mentions about visual examination, and it kind of lists, I don't want to go through the whole list, but at a minimum, visual inspection should be performed under this section, must include the following items. And it talks about safety systems, internal surfaces, surface equipment, including gaskets, fasteners, all bolted and threaded, and so on. So you can see that the visual examination has a lot of parts that fall under the visual examination. So really, now we talked about the standards. Now let's talk a little bit about visual certification and the written practice. So the written practice is what governs your NDT program. So what should the written practice include for visual testing? You know, your personnel duties and responsibilities, training requirements, experience requirements, examination requirements, and records and documentation requirements. All those, and there's more in this list, but all these will fall under your written practice for visual testing. So when you talk about the qualification and certification standards, again, I'm not saying that every one of those things we showed as far as out of the regulatory standards for visual inspection means that the person has to be certified. This is not the appropriate time to debate that, but I'm just going to say that when you get to qualification standards for visual testing, the two main ones, the main one that's going to apply for our industry would be the AAR 1002 C3 Appendix T for qualification and certification of inspectors. And also there's an ASNT TC1A, and I'll go over some of those documents here in a little bit. But the standards and guidelines for qualifying and certifying visual technicians may vary with the different VT techniques. And I can't stress that anymore, because how you're going to train your inspectors with VT can vary depending upon what technique you're going to use. And that has to really be spelled out in your company's written practice. It will follow the guidelines stated in Appendix T or SNTC 1A. We'll get into that a little more here in a second. So this is an excerpt out of the C3 manual, Appendix T, and it lists a visual examination. And notably, in Appendix T, that differs from some other certification documents, it subdivides VT into visual weld inspection. You see that on the first column on the left, visual examination method, visual as a method. And then it has the sub-techniques as weld inspection and RVI. Those are the two different techniques that fall under VT in Appendix T. As you can see, it only lists two techniques. Doesn't mean there isn't other ones. And then it gives the recommended training hours and recommended experience hours for full certification. And this excerpt comes out of TC1A. And under SNTC 1A, the American Society for Non-Destructive Testing, it mentions the method of visual testing. And as far as techniques, it doesn't list the techniques. It doesn't divide into any individual techniques under visual. It does not mean that they're not different techniques. In fact, there's probably so many that it would not be possible to probably make that list into that column. So again, they recommend training hours, but the techniques are left up to which you decide it's going to be. And the same thing, and this is out of CP 189. ASNT also has a standard. What I just showed you earlier was a recommended practice. This is a standard for qualifying and certifying technicians, but it basically has the same information. So really, what I want to do right now is get into Appendix T and talk about Appendix T. And the Appendix T does allow for limited certification depending on the techniques that you use. And you can see there in Table T3 is the minimum training and experience hours. But you are allowed to limit the hours of experience and the hours of training based off your technique. For example, if you look at the table, T3, if you look at the method of leak testing, one area where they do list out individual techniques under method is leak testing. Here they mention 5 techniques of leak testing. Each technique of those leak testing varies extremely from the other one. With bubble leak testing, you got everything from 6 hours of training for bubble leak testing if you add level 1, level 2. And if you go down to MSLT, which is mass spectrometer leak testing, for level 1, level 2 would be 64 hours of training and much more experience hours. So you can see that there's a variation depending on the technique you use. So think of visual testing in the same vein. Think of visual testing as a method, and what are your techniques, and what training and experience is needed for that technique. That's really going to be the decision that your level 3 will do. And whatever you do for limitation, it has to be stated in your written practice, and those limitations have to be on the certifications. So what would you talk about as far as a course outline for visual testing? Well, before you consider any kind of a training, the first questions you're going to really want to answer are, what is the component I'm going to be testing? What level certification will I need? Do I need to be just level 1? Do I need to be level 2? Do I need to be only a level 3? What standards apply? That's very critical, because if the standard applies, you have to make sure that you're meeting that standard. What are the critical defects? And what is the acceptance criteria? That's the first thing I know as myself as a level 3. When somebody asks me, hey, what method is the best thing to use? I say, well, hold on. What are you looking to find? What are your critical defects? That's going to dictate the best method to use. So what I'm saying is your course outline should be tailored to the program to the application, CP 105, which recommends AS&T CP 105 is a kind of a guideline for course outlines for the different ADT methods. Under visual, it talks about you should understand discontinuity causes and operating conditions. You should understand how is your defect going to appear to your inspector and how to best detect and identify these discontinuities. These are some of the things you need to think about. It also recommends, as follows a guideline, you should have an introduction to visual and remote visual inspection. Talk a little bit about fundamentals. Lighting is a very important topic to discuss in visual testing, material attributes. You always want to talk about principles and theory of your method that you're teaching and the technique. And one thing with visual testing is you have to talk a little bit about environmental and psychological factors, inspector fatigue, eye fatigue, and things like that can happen. What I'm saying is, as far as the inspector's interpretation of things, they can vary from inspector to inspector. It goes on to talk about, you need to talk about your equipment. What applications are you going to use that visual testing for? Obviously, your evaluation acceptance criteria, visual and or remote visual inspection requirements, obviously recording and documentation, terminology, and documentation again. So these are just some of the items. Again, these are not all the things that have to be in there, but these are things you need to think about as your course outline. And a course outline for doing casting inspection, and a course outline for weld inspection, and a course outline for corrosion inspection are all going to be different. You want to make sure you tailor your training program for visual testing to match the technique that you're using. And they're all going to be different with each other. And if you have several techniques at the same time, then all those techniques and all that has to be in your course outline. And your level 3 will help you with that. Another thing you would say, okay, do I have to have procedures? Obviously, if you're going to do visual testing and it's a required certification, you should have qualified and certified procedures approved by level 3. In Appendix T, in 1.18, it lists what are the requirements that have to be in your visual testing procedure. It lists personnel requirements, responsibility requirements, techniques, service preparation. It also, and so on. It also lists out essential variables and non-essential variables. And those means that if any change, if an item, for example, surface preparation requirements, if you look under essential variable column, it has an X, it means that's an essential variable. So if you would change anything in that procedure, that's an essential variable, you would have to qualify those procedures again. That's a procedure qualification. Procedures do have to be qualified, and your level 3 has to qualify those procedures, so any changes would require a new qualification. If you have a change in a non-essential, it would not need a new qualification. Very similar to what you see in welding procedures. Essential, non-essential variable. So all these, and these are for all the NDT methods that you see on this current slide. And the next slide, they have a particular section just for visual testing that adds a few more requirements. Not many, but there's a few more requirements for visual testing in Appendix T. If you notice, it says all the provisions of 1.8 above, 1.18 above, which we just showed. And it does add illumination requirements and special illumination instruments or equipment to be used. And minimum resolution requirements for remote visual for your camera. And both of those are essential variables. So lastly, I want to talk in part 6 is function-specific training. Again, this is kind of a touchy area, but in 49 CFR 172.704, hazmat training requirements. Under the hazmat training requirements, So even if you think that your technician may not necessarily need to be VT certified and qualified and certified to Appendix T, it may fall under the function-specific training that's in 172-704. In particular, function-specific training, each hazmat employee. So if you're looking at a hazmat component, a tank car, each hazmat employee must provide function-specific training concerning the requirements of this subchapter or exemptions on special permits issued under this subchapter of this chapter that are specifically applicable to the functions of the employee performs. So you could say that if my employee is employing a certain amount of visual testing on a hazmat container, that you at least have to have function-specific training for that person for visual testing. And again, it may fall under the 49 CFR 170-704. So as part of the hazmat training, it says not only do you have to do training for function specific, you also have to have an exam. It doesn't get too much detail in an exam, but there has to be an exam for your function specific training, and you do have to issue a hazmat certification. And there's other things that are under the hazmat regulations, but not part of this discussion. But for new employees, and usually the hazmat certification is good for 3 years. So really, in summary, visual testing key here is that visual testing is a method of NDT. It covers a wide range of techniques which can vary considerably from each other. Can't stress that anymore. What technique is going to apply to your program depends on regulations and companies' decisions. Types of VT techniques should be selected based off the criticality of inspection and what flaws are suspect. And again, when you're going to develop a VT inspection program other than well inspection, you really want to consult your NDT level 3, the person that's in charge of your program, to help develop a visual testing program that's really going to apply to your organization and the components that you're testing. Again, follow up a little bit quickly, but thank you. Hopefully I haven't talked your head off. But there was a lot of things that I did go over there with the visual testing. And again, this was just more of a lesson overview of things to think about, that if you're going to decide to have your visual testing, whatever visual testing that you do use, whether that program has, or that technician has to be qualified and certified, and what are the training requirements.
All right, thank you very much. We've had a few questions come in, and feel free to type the questions in the right-hand pane of the GoToWebinar window. So right now, Steve and Jim will go over the few questions that have been asked. Feel free to type more questions in. Here you go, Steve.
Okay, so one of the questions is basically, and I know in our industry we use a lot of level 2 certifications, but somebody asked, can a VT level 1 perform inspection?
Yeah, excellent question. Level 1 is a certified technician. If your procedure allows it and your written practice allows it, yes, you can designate level 1s to do certain visual testing. Now, that person should have some guidance from a level 2, at least when it gets to experience hours. But yeah, you definitely can have VT level 1s if it's appropriate for your program. That's something you would have to discuss within your organization. Make sure your level 3 is okay with that, and make sure you have it stated in your written practice.
Okay. Another question came up, and again, we hear this a lot, is with subcontractors. A lot of our subcontractors, different companies use, they follow ASNT, SNTC 1A, not Appendix T. So our subcontractors that are not certified for Appendix T, can they inspect in our industry? And what would be the requirements to make them compliant to do inspections in a repair location?
Yeah, that's another good question. Most of your Anti-2 subcontractors may not necessarily be certified, qualified, and certified, and the written practices are not necessarily written to Appendix T. Appendix T, years ago, I should say, when it first was written, really was modeled on SNTC 1A, which is more of an international, ASNT's international qualification certification standard. And that was probably 25 years ago. But since then, it has kind of diverged away from SNTC 1A and has some particular requirements that are not necessarily the same as SNTC 1A. Probably the biggest one I can think of is your certification intervals. Originally, when we wrote Appendix T, SNTC 1A said your inspectors are certified on a 3-year interval. But since then, they went to a 5-year interval for level 1 and level 2s. To a 5-year interval for level 1, level 2 inspectors. Appendix T still says they have to be on a 3-year interval. That's a little bit of an issue. So what you could do is maybe go back to your subcontractor and see if they can do some refresher training or whatever and bump up their certifications, or you may want to have somebody come in and have your level 3 come in and do maybe some refresher training and get them certified on a shorter interval. But that's something that is a little bit of an issue. And oddly is that does not mean the inspector on 5-year interval does not mean that they are not a good inspector. It's just one of the differences between Appendix T and SNTC 1A. So I'd say just don't think that it's a big issue, but it is an issue.
One of the main things is make sure you do, like Jim says, function specific training on your procedures, which kind of covers to make sure that they are up to date on their current requirements. And you document that. Make sure somebody's doing training on your current revisions. Okay, one last question, and this has come up several times. And can a CWI or SCWI sign a VT procedure, or does it have to be an ASNT level 3 VT?
I think currently in the published Appendix T, yes, you can sign off on a visual well inspector. That is a very good question.
Yeah, the current requirements, they're looking to propose to make changes to it.
Yeah, because originally Appendix T was written for just weld inspection procedures. So that's why we allowed the Appendix T allowed for a AWS-CWI to write well inspection procedures.
And it keeps going back and forth between the CWI, SCWI, because the SCWI exam takes into account a lot of the SNTTC 1A questioning, and that's always been the argument.
But I will say that if you have a visual inspection procedure that's not involving well inspection, you should have a level 3 sign-off who is a ASNT VT level 3, because that level 3, ASNT level VT level 3, part of their testing program was way beyond weld inspection, where the AWS CWI is mainly tailored just to weld inspection.
So one more question just came in. It says visual inspection for service equipment. Does the procedure or must be certified by a VT level 3 per Appendix T for service equipment? Which is a very good question.
Yeah, I know there's some issues going around about that, about whether and that's really some of the things that prompted this discussion with VT. But as you can see in Appendix D, it talks about visual inspection requirements, and then it does list Appendix D does reference that any of those methods have to be per Appendix T. So you may be able to point that person should be qualified and certified in VT. Again, it's a technique. It doesn't mean it has to be the same testing and what you did for, say, a weld inspector that has to go through weld symbols, metallurgical issues, and talking about metallurgy. The course outline for a weld inspector is very detailed. It doesn't have to be to that point. your VT training could be very, very precise in just what you're doing. It doesn't have to be a lot of hours, but the course line should cover what that inspector needs to see as far as VT. And keep in mind, currently printed VT in Appendix T, in my opinion, strictly my opinion, it was written just as a weld inspection because originally we had referenced in Appendix T AWS. But now I believe we're in a process, or Appendix T is in a process of getting revised. And I don't know, I have no idea about that, but it's in the process of getting revised. So you may look at a revision to clarify visual testing versus just a weld inspector.
Well, here's another, this is kind of interesting question. So when do you think that remote visual inspection will get to the point where it is fully approved to avoid any confined space entry in a tank car for tank car qualification? And that would be very hard to do because of,
Say that again.
So the question is basically, instead of doing, having to do confined space and go in a rail car, somebody had asked, do we ever think remote visual, like through a drone, I'm assuming that's what they're asking, would get to the point where you could put equipment or even robotic, track systems where you could go in and do a full interior inspection of a rail car without ever entering a tank?
Sure. I believe you can. Now, part of the qualification of tank car is a general visual inspection of the exterior and interior. We stated that earlier in our presentation. And then when you get to structural integrity of something like the tank seam, that may be something you're going to want to develop or use a more sensitive method, like a volumetric method, like ultrasonics or X-ray. But for the general visual inspection of dense distortion, corrosion, those things, yeah, if you have a good remote, and they're making some very big leadways right now in a remote visual equipment that's it's amazing. Actually, I've looked at some of them. I've talked to some vendors, and some of their new equipment is amazing. The clarity is amazing.
Yeah, but like with everything, you would have to expand your training. Your training would have to cover all that. You would have to make sure your people are trained, your procedures are approved to allow that type of inspection. And then, how sensitive. You're just going to have to do some type of study to make sure it's sensitive.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into reliability sensitivity. That's a topic that'll be our fourth webinar is reliability sensitivity and probability detection for procedures. When you get into a lot of different techniques, the probability of detection for cracks really doesn't apply for a lot of the other visual techniques besides weld inspection. But that's a discussion for a different day.
That's all I have for questions.
Hey, thank you. Everybody stay safe.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, keep a lookout for new registration emails for our upcoming webinars over the next few weeks. Everyone stay safe out there. I hope everyone's doing good, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.